there is a fundamental misunderstanding about work, about careers, about the way people are supposed to structure their lives. Many people have been told from the moment they could walk that they must find a job, that they must earn a living, that their security and survival depend entirely on their ability to fit into the machinery of the economy. And while there is a practical truth in that, because of course people need to support themselves, there is a much deeper and more dangerous assumption embedded in this idea that life is about securing a job rather than discovering a purpose. That work is about making money rather than contributing something meaningful to the world. That a person's value is determined not by what they build, not by the effort they pour into something meaningful, but by whether or not they have successfully slotted themselves into a pre-existing role. And that assumption is not only false, but destructive. Because if a person believes that their highest duty is simply to secure a job, then they are not aiming for something beyond themselves. They are not asking the most important questions about what they are meant to do, about what they could bring into being, about the potential that lies within them, waiting to be cultivated. Instead, they are simply looking for permission to exist. They are looking for a system to tell them that they belong, that they have value, that they are doing what they are supposed to be doing. And when people live that way, they do not thrive, they merely survive. But human beings are not meant to merely survive. The evidence of history, of psychology, of philosophy, of every great story ever told points to one thing. People need meaning more than they need comfort. People need purpose more than they need stability. When someone devotes their life to mere survival, to securing a paycheck without any deeper sense of why they are doing it, they inevitably feel empty. They may not understand why. They may think, well, I did everything I was supposed to do, didn't I? I got the degree, I submitted the applications, I got the job, and yet something feels wrong. That feeling is not an accident. It is the soul's way of warning a person that they have settled for something far too small. The question is not, where can I get a job? The question is, what is it that I am meant to do? Because there is a vast difference between the two. A job is something a person takes on to make a living, and that is not inherently wrong. But when a person looks beyond that, when they begin to ask what it is they are called to create, what problem they are meant to solve, what strength they are meant to develop, then something remarkable happens. They stop waiting for someone else to give them a role, and they start forging one themselves. And this is difficult, of course. It is much easier to simply look for a job. It is easier to follow the path that has already been laid out, to submit applications, to wait for a response, to hope that someone else will grant permission to begin working. But in doing so, a person places their future entirely in someone else's hands. They surrender control of their own direction. They make themselves dependent on forces outside of their grasp rather than taking responsibility for carving out a path that is uniquely their own. There is an alternative, and it is a far more dangerous, far more difficult, and far more rewarding path. It is the path of searching for meaning first before security. It is the path of asking, what can I build? What problem can I solve? What skill can I develop until I am so competent that the world cannot ignore me? That path does not always offer immediate financial stability. It does not come with guarantees. But it does something far more important. It forces a person to develop themselves. It forces them to become something more than a passive recipient of wages. It forces them to become a creator, an innovator, a contributor. And that is where real fulfillment is found. The people who truly shape the world are not those who merely look for jobs. They are those who see a need, who recognize a gap, who ask the difficult questions about what could be done better. They are those who refuse to wait for an opportunity and instead create one. They do not say, where can I fit in? They say, what can I make? What can I do? How can I transform my potential into something real? And yes, this is terrifying, because when a person chooses this path, they take on responsibility for their own future in a way that most people are unwilling to do. They no longer have the comfort of blaming the job market or the economy or their lack of connections. They are forced to confront themselves, to face their own inadequacies, to develop themselves into something more. But that is the only path that leads to true significance. That is the only way a person can look back at their life and say, I didn't just take what was given to me, I built something. I became something. So the answer is not to simply look for a job. It is to look for the thing that makes you come alive, to develop the skills and abilities necessary to bring that thing into being, and to trust that in doing so you will find a way to sustain yourself. Because when a person commits to something real, when they aim for something higher than mere security, they find that the world has a way of making room for them. Opportunities arise that they could not have anticipated. Doors open that would have remained closed if they had only been looking for a paycheck. And so the question is not whether you will find a job, the question is whether you will find yourself, whether you will seek out meaning rather than mere stability, whether you will take responsibility for developing something of true value. Because if you do, you will not just find work, you will find purpose. And that is something far greater than a job. People are not meant to live just to make ends meet. There is something profoundly wrong with the idea that life should be structured around the single goal of financial survival. It reduces human existence to a mechanical process. Wake up, work, earn, sleep, repeat. And yet, this is what many people accept as the only viable option. They believe that the highest aim is to secure a stable job, pay the bills, and retire with just enough money to get by. But this is an impoverished way of thinking. It is a narrow, fear-driven approach to life that disregards the fact that people are built for something much greater than mere survival. And yet, it's easy to understand why so many people fall into this trap. From childhood, they are told that security is the most important thing, that their job is to find a safe, respectable way to earn money, that their ability to survive in the world depends on their willingness to fit into a predefined role. They are taught that risk is dangerous, that stepping outside the lines is reckless, that seeking meaning before stability is naive. But what if this is all wrong? What if the real danger is not in stepping outside the system, but in surrendering entirely to it? What if the real risk is spending an entire life chasing security at the cost of purpose? Because here's the thing. No amount of security will ever compensate for a life lived without meaning. People who chase after safety and stability above all else often find themselves deeply dissatisfied. They check all the boxes, they get the degree, they secure the job, they build the predictable routine, but something is missing. They feel an underlying sense of emptiness, of restlessness, of frustration that they can't quite explain. And the reason for that is simple. They were made for more than this. A person who only works to survive becomes stagnant. Their spirit deteriorates. They go to work, they go home, they distract themselves with entertainment, and they repeat the process indefinitely. They may be comfortable, but they are not alive in any real sense. Because real life requires struggle. It requires movement. It requires purpose. And purpose is not found in simply maintaining an existence. Purpose is found in pushing towards something greater, in building something meaningful, in taking on a responsibility that demands more than just the bare minimum required to survive. And this isn't just some abstract philosophical argument. It's something deeply practical. Because when people pursue only security, they trap themselves in cycles of mediocrity. They make decisions based on fear rather than vision. They choose careers they don't care about because they seem stable. They suppress their real interests and talents because they don't fit into a neat conventional framework. And then they wonder why they feel lost, why they feel exhausted, why they wake up dreading the day ahead. What people fail to realize is that the best way to secure a future is not to chase stability, but to become someone so competent, so valuable, so indispensable that opportunities arise naturally. The world doesn't reward those who play it safe. It rewards those who develop mastery, those who contribute something real, those who step forward with a willingness to take risks and create something meaningful. The path forward then is not to seek security first, but to seek competence, to seek meaning, to seek responsibility. A person who spends their time developing real skills, refining their abilities and contributing in ways that actually matter, will not be left behind. They will not be forgotten. They will not struggle for opportunities because the world will always make space for those who bring something of value. But this requires a fundamental shift in mindset. It requires rejecting the idea that a job is the answer to life's problems. A job is a tool, nothing more. It is a means, not an end. The real question is not whether a person can find employment. It is whether they can find a reason to get up in the morning, a reason to push forward, a reason to strive for something beyond themselves. And that is not something that can be handed to a person. It must be sought. It must be fought for. It must be earned through the difficult process of self-examination, of effort, of trial and error. It requires asking, what do I actually care about? What problems do I want to solve? What kind of person do I want to become? It requires an understanding that fulfillment comes not from external validation, but from the internal sense of knowing that one is on the right path. This is not an easy way to live. It demands more than passive existence. It demands that a person stop waiting for direction and take responsibility for shaping their own future. It requires an acceptance of the fact that failure is inevitable, that struggle is unavoidable, that risk is part of the equation. But the alternative, the slow decay of a life spent merely getting by, is far worse. So the question is not whether a person should look for a job. The real question is whether they are willing to look for something far more valuable, meaning, mastery, and purpose. Because those who seek only stability will never find fulfillment. But those who seek to become something greater than they are will always find a way forward. And in the end, that is the only path worth taking. People often underestimate the power of responsibility. They think of it as a burden, something to be avoided, something that weighs them down. And yet nothing could be further from the truth. Responsibility is not a weight, it is a foundation. It is the very structure upon which a meaningful life is built. And yet many people reject it. They seek instead a life of comfort, of ease, of minimal struggle. They want to find a way to get by without having to bear the difficulties that come with real responsibility. And in doing so, they set themselves up for something far worse than hardship. They set themselves up for purposelessness. Because here's what happens when people avoid responsibility. They drift. They wander aimlessly through life, moving from one job to the next, one distraction to the next, one temporary pleasure to the next, without ever finding anything substantial to hold on to. And then they wonder why they feel anxious, why they feel unfulfilled, why they feel as though something important is missing. The answer is simple. What's missing is the very thing they've been avoiding. What's missing is responsibility. A person without responsibility is a person without direction. And a person without direction is lost. That's not just some abstract philosophical claim, it's an observable fact. Look at the people who feel most adrift in life. They are often the ones who have avoided committing to anything truly meaningful. They are the ones who have spent years trying to keep their options open, refusing to dedicate themselves to anything that requires real effort. And what has it brought them? Not freedom, not fulfillment, not security, but rather a deep sense of uncertainty, of unease, of dissatisfaction that they can't seem to shake. And this is the great irony. People avoid responsibility because they think it will limit them, but in reality, it is what gives them strength. It is what provides structure, meaning, and a clear path forward. Think about it this way: when a person takes on a real responsibility, something significant happens. They stop living merely for themselves. They stop making decisions based only on what is easy or immediately gratifying. Instead, they start acting with purpose. They develop discipline. They develop resilience. They develop the ability to persevere through hardship because they know that what they are working toward actually matters. This is why responsibility should not be feared, it should be sought out. A person who refuses responsibility is not free. They are merely unanchored. They are like a ship that has been cut loose from its moorings, drifting wherever the waves take it. That might seem appealing at first: no obligations, no restrictions, no burdens. But before long, it becomes clear that such a life is not liberating at all. It is exhausting. It is disorienting. It is ultimately meaningless. And this isn't just about career choices. It's about how people approach life itself. Because responsibility extends far beyond the job. It extends into relationships, into personal growth, into the very way people see themselves. A person who refuses responsibility in one area of life will often refuse it in others as well. They avoid commitment. They avoid challenge. They avoid anything that requires them to step beyond their immediate desires. And over time, this avoidance accumulates. It turns into regret. It turns into a realization, sometimes too late, that the most valuable things in life were the very things they turned away from. So what's the solution? The solution is to stop running from responsibility and start embracing it. To stop seeing it as something to be endured and start seeing it as something that provides direction and meaning. Because the moment a person takes on real responsibility, everything changes. They begin to understand what it means to work towards something greater than themselves. They begin to see the world not as a place that owes them comfort, but as a place that challenges them to become more than they currently are. And this is where real security comes from, not from avoiding hardship, but from developing the competence to face it. Because the world is unpredictable. Circumstances change. Stability is never guaranteed. But a person who has built themselves into someone strong, someone capable, someone responsible, such a person will always have a way forward. They will not crumble under pressure. They will not be easily replaced. They will not be left behind. This is the challenge then, to take on responsibility willingly, to seek it out rather than avoid it, to understand that the weight of responsibility is not a burden but a privilege. Because in the end, the question is not whether you will face difficulties in life. You will. The question is whether you will be strong enough to bear them. And the only way to develop that strength is to take on responsibility, to commit to something meaningful, and to build a life that is not just about survival, but about purpose. People often assume that the goal of life is to be happy, that if they can just find the right job, the right relationship, the right set of circumstances, then they'll finally experience some lasting state of contentment. But happiness is not a goal, it's a byproduct. It emerges as a consequence of aiming at something meaningful, of carrying a burden worth bearing, of voluntarily taking on the weight of responsibility. And yet many people spend their lives chasing happiness as if it were something that could be directly acquired. They seek comfort, pleasure, and ease, believing that these things will bring them fulfillment. But they don't. Because fulfillment is not found in a life of passive enjoyment. It is found in striving towards something that matters. And so, people need to ask themselves a crucial question. What are they aiming at? Because everyone is aiming at something, whether they realize it or not. Some aim for financial security, others aim for status or recognition, while others simply aim for the avoidance of pain. But aiming at the wrong thing, aiming at something shallow, something short-term, something merely comfortable, leads to a sense of emptiness. It leads to the realization, often years later, that they have been climbing a ladder that was leaning against the wrong wall. And this is one of the great tragedies of modern life. People are not encouraged to aim high. They are told to be realistic, to play it safe, to not take on too much. They are told that ambition is dangerous, that striving too hard will lead to disappointment, that wanting more than a stable, predictable existence is arrogant or foolish. But what is the alternative? To aim at nothing? To simply drift through life without a guiding principle, without a goal worth pursuing? That is not a life. That is a slow decay. And this decay manifests in many ways. It manifests as frustration, as boredom, as resentment. It manifests as the nagging sense that something is missing, that life is passing by in a series of meaningless routines. It manifests as anxiety because a person who has no clear direction is left vulnerable to every passing circumstance, every shift in the world around them. They are like a ship without a rudder, tossed about by the waves with no control over where they are going. But when a person chooses to aim at something meaningful, when they voluntarily take on the responsibility of working toward a worthy goal, everything changes. They stop being passive observers of their own lives and become active participants. They develop resilience because they have a reason to endure hardship. They develop discipline because their efforts are directed towards something that actually matters. They develop a sense of purpose because they know that what they are doing is not just about them, but about something greater. And this requires sacrifice, because to aim at something meaningful means to give up other possibilities. It means choosing one path and letting go of others. It means accepting that there will be struggle, that there will be setbacks, that failure is not just possible, but inevitable. But what is the alternative? To refuse to commit to anything, to live in a state of endless hesitation, never fully engaging with life, never fully investing in anything. That is not freedom, that is paralysis. And so the challenge is clear. People must decide what they are aiming at. They must take the time to think deeply about what actually matters to them, not what they have been told to value, not what others expect of them, but what is truly meaningful. And then they must pursue it wholeheartedly with everything they have. Because when a person commits to a worthy goal, when they willingly take on the responsibility of striving towards something significant, they transform. They become stronger, more capable, more resilient. They become the kind of person who is not just surviving, but truly living. And so the question is not whether life will be difficult, it will be. The question is whether the difficulty will be in service of something worthwhile. Because a life spent avoiding hardship is a life spent avoiding meaning. And in the end, the only thing worse than the struggle of aiming high is the regret of never having aimed at all. As she sat watching the world go by, something caught her eye. It wasn't so much its color or shape, but the way it was moving. She squinted to see if she could better understand what it was and where it was going. But people often live under the illusion that avoiding conflict makes life easier. They believe that if they can just keep the peace, avoid upsetting anyone, and refrain from rocking the boat, then everything will work out fine. But that is a dangerous and naive way of thinking. Because avoiding conflict does not eliminate problems, it merely postpones them, allowing them to grow in the shadows until they become unmanageable. And when people make a habit of avoiding confrontation, they slowly erode their own strength, their own voice, and ultimately their own sense of self. There is a great cost to constantly trying to be agreeable. People think they are being kind, that they are maintaining harmony, that they are making life better for themselves and for those around them. But what they are actually doing is suppressing their own needs, their own thoughts, their own values. They are trading authenticity for temporary peace. And in doing so, they are betraying themselves. And that betrayal does not go unnoticed. It manifests in resentment, in frustration, in a creeping sense of powerlessness that seeps into every aspect of their lives. This is not to say that people should seek out conflict for its own sake. That is foolish. But there is a profound difference between unnecessary aggression and the willingness to stand up for what is right. A person who never stands up for themselves, who never expresses disagreement, who never asserts their own boundaries, is not a peaceful person. They are merely submissive. And submission in this sense does not lead to respect. It leads to exploitation. It leads to being overlooked, dismissed, and taken advantage of. Because the world does not reward those who stay silent when they should speak. It rewards those who have the courage to assert themselves when it matters. And the problem is that this pattern of avoidance does not stay confined to minor disagreements. It becomes a way of life. It seeps into relationships, into careers, into the very way a person sees themselves. Someone who has spent years avoiding confrontation, who has made a habit of saying yes when they should say no, will eventually lose the ability to even recognize what they truly want. They will find themselves drifting, making decisions based on what pleases others rather than what aligns with their own values. And over time, this erodes their confidence, their sense of identity, their ability to take control of their own destiny. And so the question becomes, what is the alternative? The alternative is to develop the capacity to engage in necessary conflict, to understand that standing up for oneself is not an act of cruelty, but an act of integrity. It means recognizing that some things are worth fighting for: boundaries, principles, self-respect. It means learning to say no when something is unacceptable, to speak up when something is wrong, to push back when necessary. Because the ability to engage in conflict is not just a tool for self-preservation, it is a fundamental requirement for living a life of authenticity. But developing this ability requires practice. It requires consciously stepping into discomfort, confronting difficult conversations rather than avoiding them, challenging oneself to speak when silence would be easier. It requires a willingness to be disliked, to accept that not everyone will approve, to prioritize truth over mere harmony. Because the alternative, the life of quiet submission, of passive agreement, of unspoken resentment, is far worse. And so, the choice is clear. People must decide whether they will live as passive observers in their own lives or as active participants. They must decide whether they will shrink from confrontation or meet it head-on when necessary. They must decide whether they will sacrifice their own authenticity for the illusion of peace or embrace the responsibility of standing firm in their beliefs. Because in the end, the world does not need more people who avoid conflict. It needs people who have the courage to stand for something, to speak with conviction, to refuse to be diminished by fear. And that is not just an option, it is a necessity. People often underestimate the profound impact of the words they speak. They assume that if they are polite, agreeable, and inoffensive, they will be liked and accepted, and that this acceptance will lead to success or at least to an easy life. But this is a grave mistake, because words are not merely sounds or gestures of politeness, they are instruments of truth, tools for shaping reality. And when people choose to be agreeable at the expense of honesty, when they say what they think others want to hear rather than what they truly believe, they weaken themselves. They become trapped in a cycle of self-censorship, and in doing so, they surrender their own power. When people fail to speak the truth, they allow falsehoods to grow. This is not just an abstract ethical principle, it is a reality that manifests in everyday life. When an employee stays silent about an injustice at work, they do not make the situation better. They permit it to continue. When a person remains quiet in a relationship out of fear of conflict, they do not preserve peace. They allow resentment to build beneath the surface. When a society encourages its people to suppress their genuine thoughts, it does not create harmony. It creates a climate of fear where deception becomes the norm and where truth itself is seen as dangerous. And what happens to those who refuse to speak the truth? They become passive, anxious, uncertain. They begin to doubt themselves, to wonder if their instincts are wrong, if their perceptions are invalid, if their own voice is unworthy of being heard. They erode their confidence one small compromise at a time until one day they up and realize that they have no real opinions of their own anymore, only a series of rehearsed, socially acceptable responses that have been shaped by the expectations of others. And that is a tragic fate, because a person who cannot express themselves truthfully is not truly living. They are merely performing. But here's the thing, speaking the truth is difficult. It is uncomfortable. It is risky. It often brings conflict, rejection, and discomfort. It demands courage, because the moment a person speaks with honesty, they expose themselves. They make themselves vulnerable to criticism, to disagreement, to judgment. And so many people avoid it. They opt instead for safe conversations, for neutral topics, for the kind of speech that offends no one but means nothing. But what is the cost of this avoidance? The cost is a life of quiet suffocation. A life in which a person never truly stands for anything, never truly engages with the world, never truly asserts their own existence. The cost is a sense of deep frustration, the feeling that something is missing, that something important has been left unsaid. And the longer this avoidance continues, the harder it becomes to reverse. And so the only way forward is to make the decision to speak the truth, no matter the cost. This does not mean being reckless, cruel, or insensitive. It means being clear, being honest, being willing to engage in the difficult conversations that actually matter. It means refusing to let fear dictate speech, refusing to let social pressure silence what needs to be said. It means recognizing that while truth may bring discomfort in the short term, it is the only foundation upon which a meaningful life can be built. Because the alternative, the life of quiet submission, of suppressed opinions, of endless self-censorship, is no life at all. It is a slow descent into insignificance, and no one should willingly choose that path. Because in the end, a person is not defined by how well they avoid conflict. They are defined by what they stand for, by what they are willing to say, by the truths they refuse to betray. And that is a choice every person must make.